Hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this discussion sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society for Professional Journalists. My name is Alan Motenko, and I'm pleased to be here today with award-winning New York Times reporter Peter Baker. We'll give you a bit of a brief bio about Mr. Baker before we dive into questions. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, covering President Trump. He previously covered the presidencies of Joe Biden, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. I should add that he also covered the first Trump term. He joined the Times in 2008 after 20 years of the Washington Post. Mr. Baker and his wife, Susan Glasser, of Politico and the New Yorker, I believe, also spent 4 years as Moscow bureau chiefs, chronicling the rise of Vladimir Putin, the rollback of Russian democracy. And he's written 7 books, most recently The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021, with his wife, Ms. Glasser. So, Mr. Baker, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be with you guys, and please call me Peter.
Peter, all right, great, thank you so much. So, Peter, let's dive in. We're going to ask you a bit about your career and a bit about your thoughts on where we are in society, but we start with the question we always start with for these interviews, and that is, how'd you get your start in journalism?
I got my start in journalism in 3rd grade, if you can believe that. I had a
I do believe it, actually. That's not, stranger
yeah,
things happen.
I had a very lovely teacher who made me editor of the class paper, and it just seemed like a world of fun to be able to find out what was going on and tell other people. And one thing leads to another, right? School paper after school paper, you go to college and start getting internships. And my first paper after leaving college was the Washington Times in Washington, which was a smaller paper that was willing to take people who would work for free or close to free, even if they had no experience. And great opportunity, great experience, and I loved every minute of it, and I've loved every minute since.
You just kept going. Now, is there a time capsule somewhere with the 3rd grade edition of Peter Baker's journalism?
She got in touch with me about 10 or 15 years ago and sent me a copy of the
Oh,
paper that,
wow.
and it's honest. I don't know if you guys are probably too young, but they had this purple thing, the mimeograph machine or whatever, and so
Hmm.
it's got purple ink, and it's truly awful. But it's yeah, that's it's an archive that nobody else will care about but me.
But and it held up, so that it goes to show
Oh
you
well,
they don't make it like they used to.
yeah, that's right, that's right.
Before we get to the Washington Times, I have to talk about your experience at Oberlin. You were writing, as far as I understand it, for the Oberlin Review, although you did not graduate, as I hear. Before
Yeah.
we talk about that, stories that you covered at Oberlin, do you recall any?
Nothing like as grand as what today's college students are covering. I've been so impressed to watch the student journalists of today grapple with these really big issues. Gaza and the Trump administration's attack on some of these big institutions, and as well as just sort of cultural issues like sexual misconduct and so on. We had a relatively quiescent time when I was at Oberlin. The biggest story on campus during the 2 years I was there was we had protests against apartheid. Not that there was apartheid at Oberlin, but the students wanted there to be divestment, and so I remember a lot of protests about that. The students took over the main administration building for a few hours. That was sort of the height of excitement at our campus.
What do you make of that experience in light of the campus protests around Gaza? Does it feel like deja vu?
Well, no, not really. I mean, the difference between protests in the past and the protests that the younger generation is dealing with today is that during my era, apartheid, during earlier eras like Vietnam, issues like women's rights or civil rights, the students were broadly on the same side, right? There were a lot of students who were apathetic, didn't care. But to the extent the students did care, they were broadly on the same side and against the administration or against, the powers that be in Washington or what have you. I think what the current generation is grappling with is something much harder, much more complicated, because in fact the students aren't all on the same side; that they are students on different sides, and they're instead of all of them together going against the people in power, they're kind of going against each other in a way that's very, I think, very hard. I've got a son in college, and I see corrosive and divisive that is. So that's a little different than when I was young.
Interesting. Okay. Now, I want to ask you about why you left Oberlin, but I do want to contrast it and give you a chance to toot the horn of your son, who is
Mm,
the youngest Polk Award winner, I
yeah,
think, in the history of that award. Uh, Not only is he still in college, as far as I understand it, he goes to a place that people have probably heard of called Stanford. And
yeah,
he's actually, for a while there, had the nation pretty gripped with his coverage of the president of Stanford, not exactly being honest with his background. So, as
yeah.
somebody who didn't stay in college, have a son who's like a Polk Award winner, what are your feelings
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, yeah, this is a classic do as I say, not as I do kind of fatherly advice kind of situation here. And I could spend all day or all night talking about my son, so I'll try to spare you the fatherly pride too much. But yeah, he's had a remarkable experience in college journalism, much better than I ever did. And he's, as you say, he's still in school, and I think hopefully, knock wood, he's going to graduate in June, which I did not do. So I'm he's done everything right where I did everything wrong.
Mazel tov. Now, okay, so well, you haven't done everything wrong because clearly your decision to leave Oberlin worked out somewhat okay. But do you recall why you left? Do you recall kind of?
I recall, yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
I recall.
Looking back on it, what do you recall?
It's pretty straightforward. If they don't give you passing grades, they really don't want you coming back. And that
Got
was
it.
the old you can't fire me, I quit kind of thing. We could debate whether they kicked me out or I dropped out, but either way, I wasn't very successful as a student. So the goal at the time was to take a year off and then come back. But I did get this job at the Washington Times, and it was just too much fun. And I never, one of these days I am going to go back, but it's been a few years. So
So you found the career that you enjoyed, and you said this is what I meant to do, and you were able to apply yourself to it in a way that college just wasn't it.
well,
Fair to say.
it was a great adventure for me. It's still a great adventure. But again, I don't give that advice to young people. I say don't do what I did. I mean, I really think finishing college is still your highest priority as a young person. I still think there's something remarkable about that. Not because you're going to get specific career help even necessarily, but because you're only going to have one time in your life when you can just explore your interests, when you can be young, when you can not have to worry about paying the rent and paying, and getting babysitters and all the things that come later in life, all of which are great in their own way, but take the time when you're young, I always say, and enjoy college while you can. Get the most out of it. Don't look at it as a career thing. Look at it as an exploration thing. And I wish I had done that. That's what I regret.
As Adam points out, you did get an honorary degree, so there is that at least. So if you decide not to go back, you have something with Oberlin on. I am curious, and it just occurred to me, but I do think it's worth asking. Do you think your outcome would have been different if you'd gone to school in a time where citizen journalism
Hmm.
is far more prevalent than it was maybe when you were in school?
That's a really good question because you're right. How much has changed in the time since I started in journalism? I mean, we didn't have iPhones, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have citizen journalists. We had three main networks, right? A few handful of really big national papers and news magazines, and that was pretty much it. And today it's much more of a free for all, right? And now, in a lot of ways, that's great. In a lot of ways, it's remarkable. The expansion, explosion of the marketplace of ideas is I think in the best sense a really healthy thing for society. A lot more people have a voice now. A lot more people can participate in the conversation, and there are a lot more places to go for information than just the very handful of places that were acting as a filter in a way. The downside is pretty obvious as well, which is that you get corners of the internet that are just half baked or full of disinformation or so consumed by ideology that it's not really about reporting and it's really about confirmation of what you already believe because we're all going to tell each other we're right, and that's something very different than 40 years ago when I got started.
So we'll come back to that, but I appreciate your thoughts on that. So you mentioned that you went to the Washington Times, both because I'm sure you were a better writer than you gave yourself credit for, and because they were willing to take folks from all different
Cheap labor.
backgrounds.
Cheap labor is always pretty appealing to people.
Yeah, I know you weren't covering Washington at that point. You were covering suburbs and Virginia and municipal government and all kinds of things. But was the political bent of the paper the same as it was now? or is now? Did you feel any of that, or was it pretty agnostic?
Yeah, no, it was a conservative paper, and it had a very conservative ownership and conservative editorial page. From time to time, that bled into the news pages, but I worked on Metro, which was not nearly affected by politics one way or the other. I was listening to the cop scanner at night and chasing after, a fire or a murder or something like that. Going to the school board where they were arguing about boundaries or things like that. There were some things that are political in on Metro as well, but the politics of the paper didn't really have much to do with that. And the reporters I worked with there were just largely just a really great group of professionals. They just wanted to get the story. And the great thing about a paper like the Washington Times, which only had 100,000 circulation compared to the Post, which was a giant with 800,000 at the time. The great thing about that was you work for the underdog, right? And it was so much fun because you got a story that they didn't have. Wow, that was so exciting. And if they beat you on a story, which of course they're going to do, well, of course they're going to do it because they're much bigger and have more people. So there was something fun about that. Very, very, kind of the raw feeling of journalism as it used to be when it was just about chasing the story and seeing if you can get it done and by deadline and see if you beat the other guys, see if they beat you.
And how did you end up with the Post?
Well, I was lucky enough to jump into their metro section. By the time I'd been at the Washington Times for a couple of years, I knew the territory, and they were looking for somebody to cover Fairfax County schools right outside of Washington, D.C. I went to Fairfax County schools where I grew up, so I had a little bit of an advantage, and it was fun. It was great to be able to cover, your own home community. The principal at my high school ended up being the deputy school superintendent, and I remember she told me when I got the job, she said, "Well, I'll be your good source for you." And I was laughing because, like, in truth, she was the one who kind of like tried to shut down the school paper when I was in high school. So she really wasn't going to be a good source for me, but it was a great joy to get a chance to cover your home community.
That's great. That's really great. So the only thing better than covering your home community is getting asked to cover the White House? Or
Yeah, sometimes there are times, between I went to Richmond and Richmond, the state capital of Virginia, of course, was awfully fun. And in some ways, one of those fun things I did because it had a lot of the big issues of the day come through state capitals, but you have so much more access to people. You could talk to anybody you want on any given day. We knew what time the governor was going to walk across the way from the mansion from his office to the mansion to have lunch. So you could always intercept him and ask him a question or two. Any legislator would talk to you. Nobody was sitting there doing this BS game about, background this and super duper background that. And it was just very real. So that in some ways was the kind of purest journalism experience that I got to have. But yeah, going to the White House was a treat, and it was an accident. They didn't really mean for me to be at the White House. I actually got hired off of Metro to go to the Miami bureau for the national desk, but they asked me if I would fill in for a couple months at the White House because one of the reporters there was sick, and they needed somebody to sit in the seat. And just happened to work out that I ended up staying.
so, I mean, ended up staying is a really nice way to say been begged to cover 5 presidents in a row. But we'll come back to
Somebody's going to remind me that I'm supposed to be going to Miami any day now. They're going to send me down there.
we're back to Jerusalem, right?
Perfect.
So we'll get there. But so you're covering, you're keeping the seat warm. You're just happy to be there, certainly, although working hard. You're expecting to go to a warmer climate at some point, and then the Lewinsky story falls into your lap. Is that an
Well,
oversimplification?
by the time the Lewinsky story happened, I was pretty well situated at the White House. I was going to stay at that point. It was about
Okay.
a year and a half into to my time there. Um, but yeah, the Lewinsky story was a crazy story. It was as you guys know, or I assume maybe people don't know anymore, but the President of the United States was accused of having an affair with a White House intern. We learned about it from our colleagues over at Newsweek were chasing this. The story got killed there.
Mhm.
Uh, Matt Drudge, who ran a internet site, I don't know if anybody still reads him or not. I think he's still very popular in some places. Published a little item about how Newsweek had killed this story. It was very sensational, but we didn't run things that had been on the internet at the time. So we started chasing and trying to figure out what was going on, and we discovered that not only was there this accusation about the president, but the Ken Starr, the independent counsel, was actually investigating whether the president had lied under oath or suborned perjury, and I think that launched it into a huge story.
What do you remember about that time, about the coverage? I mean, it was not just a obviously not just a one story deal. You were probably busy for the better part of a year chasing lead after lead and then going to impeachment and all these things. All these years later, what are some of the things that stick out to you when you think about that
Yeah.
time?
Well, yeah, it was a 13-month story, pretty much 24/7. The most consuming thing I thought I would ever do. I thought the biggest story I would ever cover in my life. I mean,
Yeah.
president in a sex scandal and then impeached and having a trial in the Senate. We hadn't had a trial in the Senate since 1868, right? Since Andrew Johnson. This is history, and it was really, from a reporter's point of view and a history buff's point of view, an extraordinary thing to cover. But it was tense. It was stressful. Obviously, no White House likes its coverage in normal times. It certainly didn't like our coverage during this time. Very stressful. The aides that we dealt with all the time were mad at us, yelled at us. I got kicked out. I remember one screaming match in a White House deputy press secretary's office where he got so mad at me he actually stood up and stormed out of his own office. And so I was just left there like, okay, what do I do now? So they were stressed and they were mad at the president as well as the press, right? They were mad at the president, but they took it out on us because they couldn't take it out on him. And so for a reporter, it was a real, a crucible. It was a big early moment in high stakes journalism. You couldn't get anything wrong. You had to be super duper careful. We made a rule when we started that story. We were not going to report anything that somebody else had reported unless we could match it through our own reporting. We weren't going to write a story saying, we were at the Washington Post at the time. We didn't write a story saying the New York Times said this, or the New York Post said this, or internet says this, unless we knew it to be true for our own reporting, because we did not want to get anything wrong. And so it was a complicated story. It was sensitive. These kind of sex scandals hadn't really played out the way they seem much more common today. At the time, everybody was very skittish and uncomfortable about it because it went beyond what normal journalism seemed to be about. But because he was accused not just of having sex, but because he was accused of corrupting a lawsuit in which he was a defendant by lying under oath and obstructing justice, it was a legitimate story, but it still meant it was very complicated and uncomfortable because there are a lot of very personal aspects to it.
Do you look back on that and go, um, I guess let me say it this way. Do you look back on that with pride? Do you look back on that with, oh my gosh, I can't believe I survived? What's your takeaway?
Well, look, I know a lot of people afterwards, especially after 9/11, look back on that and say, "Oh my God, how small, right? Why did the country get so wrapped up in something so minor and so petty it seemed like?" And there's a lot of criticism of the journalism. Did we overhype it? Da 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 da. And I understand that, and I think that's a legitimate argument to have and a legitimate conversation to have. But I still think actually it was important. I think it's important when the President of the United States, doesn't tell the truth under oath. I think that still should matter. I think it's important when the President of the United States, tries to, seemingly anyway, that the conclusion of the investigation, try to get other people not to tell the truth under oath. And I think that there's something now in the post-Me Too movement. I think we also look back on that, even aside from the legal aspects of it, a little differently. That the power dynamic, even though it was a consensual tryst, if you want to call it that, affair, the power dynamic between the most powerful person in the world and a 22-year-old intern is so substantial that I think we look at that a little differently today than we did at the time when a lot of people were willing to forgive it. And there are other accusations against him other than Monica Lewinsky that were more serious in terms of the alleged sexual misconduct. So, I feel like our coverage was responsible. I know there's a lot of criticism of it. Maybe we do it somewhat differently. I think you could argue that the country as a whole maybe had more important things to be focused on, like the future threat of terrorism and everything. And it said something about our moment in the 1990s that this was so dominant. This current president's been accused of much worse and been impeached twice. And we don't focus on it with the same intensity because there's so many other things also going on, competing for our attention, competing for our time. So I think in some ways it's a reflection of the 1990s, a time of peace and prosperity where we could afford to focus on issues like this with great intensity. But I don't regret our coverage. I think we did the responsible thing. If you actually go back and look at what we wrote, I'm not saying for everybody's coverage. I'll let everybody talk about their own, but I think that the post coverage was, you know, I think we met the moment.
Now, did you get to sort of write your own ticket to Moscow? Was that somewhere you wanted to go after that, or were you asked by the Post to go to Moscow? How did that come about?
Yeah, the foreign editor came and asked, and it was a great opportunity. I actually, they didn't know this, but it was something I always wanted to do. When I was in high school, right before high school, I took a summer class about Soviet society. And in that class, we read a couple books that had been written by Moscow correspondents, Russia by Bob Kaiser and the Russians by Hedrick Smith, who they were from the Post and the Times, respectively. And I read these books. I'm like, that's what I want to do. I want to go to this place. I want to learn about it. I want to be a correspondent and tell stories to people back home about what's happening in this very different culture and very different part of the world. And so when they came and said, "Hey, would you want to go to Moscow?" I was like, "You bet I do. That's just something I've always thought would be great." So Susan at the time and I were about to get married, and then we got married right before we left, and our honeymoon was in Siberia, and we were co-bureau chiefs there for 4 years, which were actually pretty important years. We thought people were kind of sympathetic to us. They said, "Ah, I'm sorry you're going when it's so boring. It's not going to be exciting the way it was." And with Gorbachev and Yeltsin, because this Putin guy, he's going to be boring. He's a bureaucrat. And no, actually, I think the 4 years we were there, which were Putin's first 4 years for the most part, were actually the most pivotal moment in Russia in the last generation.
Let's pause there for a second. What's your take on, from what you learned studying Putin, covering Putin, living there for 4 years? What's your take on the Putin of today? Just
Well, we're
generally.
working on a book just about that, actually. It's funny you say.
Okay.
Susan and I wrote one of the books I wrote with Susan on our time in Moscow called Kremlin Rising. We're coming back to now and working on a new book, and this one's about the five presidents who have dealt with Putin. So it's more
Mhm,
of our side of the story, uh,
mhm.
from Clinton all the way through Trump. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? What do we misjudge about Putin? And I think there's a big debate out there. Did Putin change, or did we just not understand who he really was? And I think it's more the latter, honestly. I think he's always been who he is. You become more of who you are sometimes as you get older. There's a Russian saying, the appetite grows while eating. And so Putin has become more Putin. But it's not like he converted from, some sort of a pro-Western guy to this, imperialist, revanchist, who wants to rebuild the empire. That was always there in him. We just didn't fully recognize it.
Uh, when can we expect that book? No pressure, but it's so.
We need to write it first. It's kind of so give us some time.
That's fair. That's fair. Um, Really interesting, of course, because you're one of probably the few journalists that have actually covered all five presidents really closely. So I really look forward to that when you have the chance to take a breath and write it. But is reporting overseas different? Are the skill set different? Do you have to sort of apply yourself differently? And then coming back, are there skills that you learned over there that you brought with you to the White House?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. The skills are totally different there. In Washington, you go to briefings and you're dealing with, statements and these days tweets and all these other things and negotiating ground rules over this or that. And you can get very micro at times, right? And when you go overseas, you have to look for captivating stories that tell a bigger picture. And you're diving into places that you just don't know.
Mhm.
Your language may not be all that great. My Russian was never terrific. It was functional, but not great. And so especially because it's kind of a firefighter job where you're like racing to the latest, eruption of something, earthquake, a war, a revolution. You're constantly jetting into places that A, may be dangerous, and B, you don't know that much about, and you have to learn very quickly. So in Washington, you can specialize, you spend years learning Medicare policy and tax rates and economics and all that. But if suddenly you have to race to a place like Beslan, a tiny little town in southern Russia, because some terrorists have taken over a school building, and they're threatening to kill all the kids in there. That's a very different kind of experience. Now, what you bring back from that experience, I think, is you learn to write bigger, to write, to take larger lessons from the reporting that you have and to tell the bigger story, right? People back in Washington don't care who's appointed the deputy prime minister of Azerbaijan, right? That's the kind of thing in Washington we might spend too much journalistic energy on the who's up, who's down. Nobody cares about that about other places. So you got to find ways of saying, what's the big story about Azerbaijan that Americans might care about? Well, maybe it's because this big story is about some big refugee crisis or about their oil industry expanding or something big. So the best thing you can take home from a foreign experience to Washington is try to make sure these Washington stories aim high as well.
Now, when you came back, did you want to get back into the White House beat, or were you asked to go back to the White House beat?
It was a mutual decision. Yeah, I wanted to go back and they wanted me. It was great. In fact, it was it was so crazy. We'd been gone for 4 years. Not only did we do Moscow, we went to Afghanistan and Iraq because it was after 9/11. And yet when I
Mm.
come back to the newsroom of the Post and they put me back on the White House, they put me back literally in the same desk I had been in, same beat. And I sit down at the desk and I open the file doors and there are my files still unmoved
Wow.
from 4 years earlier. It's
But
like
you're,
it's
but
like that
you are, but you're
gone.
not but you are hardly the same person, I'd imagine, after all of that. Tell me a bit. So I apologize. So I probably should have asked you a bit about Iraq and Afghanistan. Uh, how did you end up from Moscow to Iraq and Afghanistan? Was that also your choice? And what was that experience like?
Yeah, I mean, that was an all hands on deck situation. After 9/11, we didn't have a correspondence in Afghanistan. We didn't have correspondence in Iraq on a regular basis. And so, they started scrambling people. I mean, the first couple of days after 9/11, we thought, okay, well, I mean, as everybody was, we were mourning and we were devastated and thinking about how the, horrific scenes and suffering journalistically, we thought, okay, well, nobody's really going to care much about Russia for a while. And it took us a while. This is not a good testimony to how smart we were because we weren't very smart. It took us a couple of days. Well, Susan probably figured out faster, but to realize, well, actually, our beat includes the Central Asia republics like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, those places. And they have kind of an Islamic uh, extremism problem down there too. So I said, well, I'll go down there and write about that, right? We're kind of more interested in Islamic extremism today than we used to be. So I went down to Uzbekistan and the paper says, well, okay, you can go to Uzbekistan if you want, but don't go to Tajikistan, whatever you do. I said, okay. And I went to Uzbekistan and wrote about things there. And I realized, yeah, the real story is better in Tajikistan. So I drive to Tajikistan, and only after I get across the border do I call them and tell them I'm there. And they say, fine, okay, you're in Tajikistan, but whatever you do, don't go to Afghanistan. I'm like, oh, no, I'm not going to go to Afghanistan. But after a few days, we realized Tajikistan is the only way to get into Afghanistan at that point. There was no other way in. Pakistan had closed the border. Reporters were not getting in anywhere else. But in Tajikistan, the Northern Alliance, which was the rebel force that the Americans were starting to team up with, had an embassy, and they flew a helicopter in and out, an old broken down Soviet helicopter that they flew from Dushanbe, Tajikistan into Afghanistan. So I got on one of those helicopters and went in. And I think my editors didn't want me to go because they knew how completely unprepared I was and how completely out of my depth I was. I had no clue what I was doing. The joke later became that Peter brought a wheelie bag and a blue blazer with him to Afghanistan, which is not actually true, but it's not an unreasonable joke to make because I was a guy who covered Washington. I didn't know how to go to a place like that, but it was really the most extraordinary time of my life, our lives, to go into a place like that and have to try to figure it out and just chase the story.
And is that just about relationship building, source building?
It's about relationship building, but it's also about trying to understand a culture that's so vastly different than anything we had ever encountered, right? Going to Afghanistan at that time was like going back in time to the biblical era. They had, the place was just nothing like any place on earth I'd ever been. Not a lot of running water, not a lot of electricity. I stayed in the home of a rebel commander, sleeping on his concrete floor. We had to buy a generator in the market so we could charge our satellite phones. We didn't have cell phones or anything at that time. Couldn't talk to people except, for a couple minutes at a time, once or twice a day maybe. And so there was the challenge of figuring out a completely alien culture, what was really going on when you didn't really know and had no access to information. And then also, of course, just the challenge of getting the information out, getting your stories out, because we just didn't have the technology that we have today, and it was very primitive and um, very challenging. So it was a kind of experience that you have in life where you learn more about yourself than you ever thought you would.
And then you end up going to Iraq after that?
Yeah, after that, we went to the Middle East, and in this case, I embedded with the Marines when they went into Iraq. I went into Saddam's Iraq before the war for about a month and covered it when Saddam was still there, which was challenging. They were very obviously a lot of censorship and trying to control Western reporters. We were not allowed to go anywhere without the government minders. And then I went out to Kuwait and embedded with the Marines and went in, and that was an extraordinary experience. My wife went in as well. She didn't embed; she went in unilaterally with some other journalists, which is crazy, totally. um,
But
but
less than safe, seemingly, yeah.
not the safest thing in the world, and not the thing you call home and tell your mom you're doing. So,
Or your husband.
or your
Um,
husband.
what is there a story from that time, particularly let's say in Iraq going in with the troops? I mean, so you go from being a Metro reporter to a White House reporter to saying, I've always wanted to go to Russia. Oh my goodness, uh, it's not as milk toast as advertised, and now I go from uh, the 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 hills and mountains of Afghanistan into Iraq after uh, uh, a war that was sort of very political here at home. What do you recall about your sort of your stories at that time, the relationships you built, the sort of narrative that emerged? How do you look back on that period?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I never want to be a war correspondent. That was never something I wanted to do. It's not something I would be all that interested in doing again. I so learned a lot about the people who do it regularly for a living. They are amazing people, absolutely fearless in many cases, um, and incredibly smart because you have to be smart to try to figure out what's doable, what's not, what's safe, what's not. Um, Iraq, I mean, like I was there just for the beginning, so it wasn't as political as it would later become, right?
Hmm.
At the time that I was there, first 6 months, first 8 months, you know, the war was going well, right? This is the good part when they toppled Saddam and Iraqis actually did, uh, you
Treat
know,
us like liberators.
yeah, I mean, not as much as the mythology would, but yeah, they did. They did not want Saddam to
Yeah.
be the ruler anymore. They didn't want us to be the ruler either. They didn't want us to stay. They didn't want the United States to stay, but they were certainly thrilled to get rid of Saddam. And my wife did some great stories about just the brutality of his regime, which was very Stalinist, the torture and the killings and so forth. And we often forget that today when we talk about what a mistake that war was. But for a lot of people, getting rid of Saddam was an extraordinary moment. But then obviously went downhill. And I remember two things about that. When I was covering Iraq before the war started, and I was inside Iraq, I went and did a story in Basra, which is the southern city near Iran. And I talked to these people, and they were so bitter about Americans. And some of that was because the minder was there, fine. But the minder, frankly, didn't like Saddam himself. um, but the people I was interviewing down there blamed Americans for a lot of things because Saddam had told them, right, that we were responsible for their being hungry. We were responsible for them not getting medicine. We were responsible for the depleted uranium in the bombs, which they thought were making them sick, and maybe it was. And some of that was probably true, and a lot of that was probably propaganda by Saddam. But either way, it meant that they weren't like necessarily excited about Americans. They didn't like Saddam, but they weren't like thinking that we were the great saviors. And I wrote a story. I remember writing about that because I remember thinking that this may not be the welcome that American troops are expecting. And there was a real hard time getting that story into print. It didn't fit with what everybody thought. And I remember later, once right before we went in, a couple of us interviewed this Marine intelligence officer, the senior intelligence officer for the Marine Corps that was going in, a very senior guy, really paranoid about press, did not want to talk to us. He was told to talk to us. We weren't allowed to quote him on the record. And we said, what do you expect here? He says, I expect us to be able to go straight through to Baghdad without that much trouble. But in our wake, we are going to leave a rolling civil war. He
Hmm.
saw it. He saw it from the beginning, before the first bullets were shot. This guy, this Marine intelligence officer, figured out what was going to happen. And it was a great, and I wrote a story about that, but again, it didn't make much of a difference. It didn't penetrate, I don't think. But that guy saw it, and I think other people did too.
There's a When Dick Cheney died recently, there was an article in Politico that my friend Adam, who just our president here, who you just met, sent me, and it talked about this, tried to establish sort of a through line from the sort of power vision of Dick Cheney for the modern American presidency, the neocon foreign policy, the very in your face approach to America on the world stage, and tried to draw a through line between the Iraq War, essentially, all the way to what we have now with President Trump and how he approaches the world. As somebody who saw both the war in Iraq from the front lines, but also came back and covered the Bush administration, does that hold water to you? Do you think there's lessons from that are sort of still informing the kind of politics we have now, or do you think really that was a different time by all intents and purposes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I've read about this, and I've certainly, engage. I don't debate it myself, but I've watched the debate about, how much this is trackable to that. There's
Yeah.
certainly some true to the fact that Cheney, for instance, and Bush believed in a strong executive, believed that the executive had been excessively neutralized in the post-Watergate era, especially on national security. The president ought to have a freer hand than he had had, and that they didn't necessarily want to follow some of the old rules or defer to Congress. And so fast forward, does that mean that that's precedent for Trump basically ignoring all kinds of rules and all kinds of norms and accruing to himself power that no other president has had? You can make that argument. I've seen that argument. You could also make the argument that other presidents, by the way, have done the same thing, maybe in less dramatic fashion. I mean, Obama certainly claimed power that presidents hadn't before, that he himself said that a president shouldn't have in terms of determining immigration policy without Congress passing legislation. In some cases, the Supreme Court pushed back on that. Biden on the student loans. These are smaller things than war and smaller things than the surveillance issues under Bush, but they are of a piece with presidents one after the other pushing the envelope and pushing the boundaries. Having said all that, what Trump has done is so vastly beyond what any of them did in terms of his pushing. The envelope isn't just pushed at this point; it's been shredded. He has gone so far in claiming power that no other president thought he had, and that maybe he does have it, depending on how these courts rule. We'll see. When Ronald Reagan ran for president, he said he wanted to get rid of the education department, but he never thought he could do it without Congress. And so he didn't try because he had a Democratic Congress. He knew what was going to happen. He didn't want to waste his time with that. He never thought that he could simply snap his fingers and say, there's no more education department. Trump has come and said, there's no more education department. There's no more USAID. There's no more this agency or that agency, VOA, the Voice of America, all these other parts of the government that he's basically all but gutted unilaterally without Congress participating. So you could say that's a through line from Bush and Cheney, but it's also a through line in some ways from, through the whole arc of the presidency in the last 30, 40 years as each president has tried to see how far they could go.
So I do want to come back to some significant extent to talk about President Trump, but at the risk of not wanting to yada 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 over Obama and Biden, let me just ask you briefly, sort of two things. One, maybe just sort of thumbnail both of those folks from your perspective, and then maybe is there like one thing about each person that you think maybe didn't get the right coverage, or maybe people don't necessarily fully appreciate having not sat where you sat, that maybe history so far has gotten wrong about them? Can you just give us a sense, or
Hmm.
maybe start with Obama and then talk about Biden before we get to the first Trump administration?
Yeah, Obama is a fascinating guy. He obviously inspired so many Americans, so many people around the world with his election and at least to some extent with his presidency. Um, he is a fascinating character, though, because he is a politician who rises to the absolute top of of the heap without seeming to like politics. And so there was always this push and pull with him. Um, he just disdained Washington. He disdained the whole process. He disdained the press. Fine, everybody does, I suppose. And he's an introvert. He was not a hail fellow, well met kind of guy, right? With Clinton, with Bill Clinton, you could see it. He loved a crowd, loved a crowd. I mean, they literally he would be out there, working a rope line while Hillary Clinton was in the limousine waiting for him. Like, okay, time to go, Bill. If he came out of an East Room event with a lot of people, he was all charged up. It gave him a boost, right? Gave him energy. Obama was the other way around. And this is the difference between an extrovert and introvert. I'm probably a little bit more of an introvert than a lot of people, so I get it. But with Obama being with the crowd, tapped his energy, it drained his energy. And his
Mhm.
staff used to actually learn to give him program a little few minutes of time between a big event at the East Room where he with a lot of people before having him go into his next thing. So he could kind of like recharge his batteries a little bit. That wasn't his natural state of being. When he said that to his staff, his staff would say, you need to schmooze these guys, invite the Congress people over for the Super Bowl, invite them over for a drink or whatever. And he might do it kind of reluctantly. And then a week later, some of those same senators or whatever would vote against him. And he would say, see, it's just not worth it. And it's like, that was probably looking at it too transactionally. It's not going to be, I
Mhm.
invite you for the Super Bowl next week, you vote with me. It's much more
Yeah.
about building relationships and seeing if you can, create a longer, more sustained partnership on some issues, not all of them, because you're always going to disagree. But he didn't like that. He just didn't like that. He made the joke once at the White House Correspondent Dinner that was very, I thought, telling. He said, everybody says I should have a drink with Mitch McConnell. He says, why don't you have a drink with Mitch McConnell? And it was funny. Everybody laughed. Mitch McConnell was
Right.
like a guy you want to have a drink with. Fine. But the
Right.
truth is, like, maybe Mitch McConnell was never going to be his best friend. But I was just struck by how much Obama just didn't like it. It just
Mhm.
didn't, he liked the policy. He's a smart guy, very intellectual. Um, but he just didn't like politics. And it's a hard thing to be a politician and not like politics.
So you remind me of a story. Just I don't want to. This is you're the expert, but it's a story that stuck with me. I think it was during Ted Kennedy's
Hmm.
Irish wake at the Kennedy Center or at the JFK Library.
Hmm.
I think it was John. It was either John McCain or Orrin Hatch that gets up and tells the story about going on the floor of the Senate with Ted Kennedy, and they had excoriated each other back and forth on the record. And then Ted Kennedy walks up to one of them and says, how did I do? Did I give you enough cover? Was that mean spirited enough for your people to go back you know, and I remember watching that going, oh, like professional wrestling kind of,
Yeah,
you
that's
know.
right. That's right.
But what I hear you say when you share that anecdote about President Obama was maybe that's how the game is played. Is that something that you've sort of taken
Well, look, I
away?
mean, the thing is, like, I mean, what Kennedy is doing there in that anecdote is he understands what the other politicians need, and he's trying to, he's there's a public side and the private side. Um, with Obama, there wasn't that private connection, right? So
Mm,
Kennedy would go get a drink with John McCain or Orrin Hatch. Orrin was as conservative as they came, and yet they really were close buds. They really got along pretty well and found common ground on important issues like healthcare. And it really was that friendship that allowed them to come together on some important things. And I don't think Obama saw how the investment and that would pay off. And maybe it wouldn't. Maybe he was right. Maybe the times have changed in such a way. And he had the Tea Party, which was, visceral against him and in his view, very nasty and maybe racist at times. So I think that he looked at that and thought, it's not on the level. All these people who say, you have a drink afterwards and you'll find common ground, they're not going to give me common ground. They're not going to do it. The times have changed. It's much more polarized. And it's true, Washington has become more polarized over the last, 30 some years that I've been covering national politics. And it may be that, that the old politics don't work. Biden tried it, had some success, but, it often felt like he was living in a different era that no longer exists.
um, well, that's an interesting segue because I guess the one thing, not to shortchange the presidency of Joe Biden, but um, maybe two questions. One, do you think Joe just simply waited too long to run? And two, what was your experience from where you sat uh, with respect to his sort of functional ability in the last year of his presidency.
Yeah. Well, look, he didn't wait too late too he didn't wait too long to run in the sense that he first ran in 1988. He just was
Fair
unsuccessful.
enough. Fair enough. Yes.
He
Good
waited
point.
too long to win. Let's put it
Good
that way.
point.
He
Yes.
waited too long to win. So he
Yeah.
started running in 1988. He ran again in 2008, of course, and then in 2016 thought about running. Was talked out of it by Obama. Never really forgave Obama for that. And then, of course, ran in 2020 and won. And he was not at his prime, right? He
Mhm.
was not. He was the oldest president at that time
Yeah.
ever elected president. Now
Yeah.
Trump is. He brought wisdom with you that comes with that time. At the same time, he also, felt like to a lot of people like a different generation. How many Americans remembered the things that he was talking about? He would start talking about Strom Thurmond. He would talk about, James Eastland. Senators have been gone for a long, long time. Most Americans weren't even born when they were serving in the Senate. That didn't connect with them, and the Washington's changed. And so, he got, give him credit. He got some bipartisan things done at a time when people said he couldn't do it. Most particularly the infrastructure program, which Donald Trump is now basically taking credit for, even though he opposed it. Some other bipartisan things ultimately did get aid to Ukraine passed on a bipartisan basis. It was very hard. Some spending deals. But Washington just changed, and it was no longer the place that he had grown up in. And he thought he could return things to normal after the first Trump term. But Washington wasn't just going to snap back. It defied his desires and maybe his ability to do that. Now, in terms of his age, long before the debate, we were writing stories about his age. This wasn't something that suddenly came up in June of 2024. And Americans knew it. They were very clear in polls that they thought, including Democrats, they thought that he was too old to run for another term. And maybe perfectly fine in office right now, but if he runs for another term and wins, that means he will be 86 at the time he left office. And that's just a lot to ask. Would he still be as strong and capable at 86 as he was at 82 and 83, even if you thought he was? And then by the last year, clearly he was, having issues that were even more pronounced. Now, we have interviewed a lot of people for this book we're writing about Russia, a lot of Biden people as they left. And what they say pretty consistently was that yes, obviously he became frailer. Obviously he was having memory, issues like a lot of us do. I have that happen too at times. Can't quite summon the name, can't quite summon the date, can't quite summon the detail you're looking for. And that he had trouble communicating to the public because his voice was much lower. He wasn't, a commanding presence anymore. He didn't feel comfortable giving big booming speeches or giving a lot of interviews. At the same time, they insist that he still was processing information just like he used to, that he's still making decisions like he used to, that he was not making, nobody could ever cite to me a decision he made that was different than he would have made 10 years earlier. But again, even if he thought that he was performing that part of the job fine, the communication part is part of the job. Being
Mhm.
leader of the country is part of the job of being president, and being able to command the stage, being able to communicate your message and your program and convince Americans and the rest of the world to go along with you is part of the job. And he obviously wasn't able to do that. We saw that. We all saw that in that debate.
Mhm.
So, I just think there was a sense of real denial. People just didn't want to believe that he was losing a step. People cared about him. They wanted to protect him. They also decided in a more cynical way that he was the only one they thought could beat Trump. And whatever happened in the second term was the second term's problem. They just needed to get through the election. And they thought Biden was the only one who could get through the election. I don't think they were necessarily right. But that was the thinking. And then, of course, Biden himself. I mean, the truth is, he had no peers left who could tell him maybe it's not a good idea to run for a second term. Right? His peers were mostly gone. They retired or passed away. And so the people who worked for him are people he considered to be like his kids, like sons and daughters. And they didn't have the same, stature to be able to say, "Hey, Joe, let's think about this." And there was never a meeting. He never had a meeting when she said, "Is this a good idea?" He told the public, "I'll be a transition figure." Didn't directly say he was only going to run for one term, but that's what the public took from it. And then decided, no, I got to stick around for another one because, Trump is a threat. but never asked his staff, never asked his advisors, never sat down and had a thoughtful meeting. Does this make sense? And instead, he just simply went forward and nobody challenged him.
Because if you challenge him, you end up like Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, I mean, look, there were people who wanted to run. There were people who even thought about running against him, and they were intimidated. They were told, not a good idea. They were pressured. They were told that there would be consequences if they did it. And it's really hard to run against an incumbent president, and
Yeah.
especially hard to run against an incumbent president if you were told that if you do so, you will weaken him and therefore give us Trump again.
So I think talking about turning to President Trump, I think during the first term you said that you confirmed at least to David Axelrod that you thought that Trump had been tearing at the fabric of the press and society. That's the quote I recall, tearing at the fabric of press and society. Um, you believed it then. We survived it, but here we are back again. Arguably, he's still tearing at the fabric of press and society. But Peter Baker's still the chief White House correspondent of the New York Times. And you still have a seat in the briefing room. Thank God you don't work.
Now,
Yeah, thank God you don't work at the Pentagon. But
yeah.
what's your take on in all seriousness, what's your take on his effect at the moment on the fabric of press and society? And do you think um, it's irreversible, or do you think what we saw over the last, let's say, month even is sort of proof that the fabric is holding?
Well, look, a lot of things we see in his second term are things he wanted to do or tried to do in his first term, but wasn't able to do, right?
Mm.
Either because he didn't really know how to do it. He'd never been in public office before a day in his life. He surrounded himself with people who didn't, were more conventional Republicans or, military officers, people who believed in institutions who tried to either talk him out of stuff or even actively thwarted his ideas. And now this time around, he has learned how to use power. We in our book, The Divider, we quote a national security official who spent a lot of time with him in his first term, and this official described him as like the Velociraptor in that Jurassic Park movie. You remember the you remember the scene? The kids run into the industrial kitchen and shut that door, and they think they're going to be safe, but the Velociraptors learn how to turn the handle, learn how to turn the lever, and Trump has learned how to turn the lever of power. So what we're seeing in the second term, in the first 9, 10 months, which have been so extraordinary, is the accumulation of all the things he thought he wanted to do, talked about doing in his first term, but now is doing much more effectively. He has people around him who agree with him and who have figured out how to turn that lever of power. In terms of the press specifically, I want to say that all presidents hate the press. Let's be real about that. Every president I've covered would not say nice things about me, certainly at times anyway. Joe Biden, by the way, never gave the New York Times an interview for a single day of his presidency, which, as far as I can tell, is the only president in a century who hasn't done that. Nor did he give an interview to the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Politico, any other print publication except for USA Today in the last few days of his presidency.
Well,
So
that's why he lost. Clearly, there you go.
well,
You
I
just
don't. I wouldn't say
yeah,
that, but I'd say that it does show that Trump isn't the first guy who didn't particularly like the press,
yeah, fair enough.
and not the first one we've had who's been a challenge to us. Now, the difference between Trump and these other presidents is that his line about fake news, his line about enemies of the people, it's far more corrosive and far more um, uh, extensive than any other president has ever done. Other presidents complained about the press, but they didn't say enemies of the people. And for anybody who spent time in Russia, as I did, that's a phrase that Stalin used to send people to the gulag.
Mhm.
Okay. And you can say, well, maybe the first time he used it, he didn't realize that. He's been told that. My publisher told him that. He keeps using the phrase. It doesn't matter to him. And my publisher, I was with A.G. Sulzberg, our publisher, once in the Oval Office in the first term. And he said to him, listen, I just want you to know, sir, if you want to complain about our coverage, we want to hear it. We want to hear your complaints. We'll listen to your complaints and we'll respond professionally and so forth. But this language you use has power and it matters when you say things like enemies of the press, enemies of the people. And it matters not even just here, it matters even worse in some ways around the world. Because these other leaders, autocratic leaders around the world, they don't stop at bad rhetoric or suing somebody. They actually use it to justify even worse outcomes, putting people in jail, journalists in jail, killing journalists. He urged him to think about that and to think about the language he used. And Trump says, you really think so? And then, of course, never changed a thing. In this term, we see him going beyond that and kind of actualizing that rhetoric. He by lawsuits against ABC, CBS, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. I'm a defendant in one of his lawsuits by using the FCC to put pressure on CBS. Extraordinary situation. Basically, the FCC put pressure on CBS by withholding approval for a merger, an $8 billion merger, until CBS Paramount paid Donald Trump $16 million that he can use for his library. 2 days after that lawsuit was settled and dismissed in court, 2 days afterwards, that's when the FCC approved the merger.
Mhm.
So, this is a very different press environment. There's the pool. They've taken over the White House press pool. I know that sounds like an insider thing, but what it means is the President of the United States gets to decide who asks him press questions. We don't decide anymore. He gets to decide. And if we ask a question he doesn't like, he'll kick you out of the pool. He's kicked the Associated Press out because they didn't use the Gulf of America the way he wanted them to. Basically, he's kicked out the Wall Street Journal because he didn't like the story about the Epstein letter. So,
Mhm.
this is pernicious. This is something we haven't seen other presidents do.
Two questions quickly, unfortunately, only because I really want to be respectful of your
I'll be
time.
fast.
Um, the first is, interestingly, after the election results the other night, it was notable that he didn't contest that there was a fraud in the election. He came out and admitted that the shutdown was probably hurting Republicans more than Democrats. The Democrats then cave, some would argue. Uh, and now we're on to the Epstein files, part deux. And I'm just wondering what your thought of the last sort of week or two. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on sort of where this is going, to the extent that anybody can predict anything, Peter. You've seen 5 presidents. You were in Moscow, you were in Afghanistan and Iraq. You were called back from Jerusalem because they thought only you, or if we had our druthers, only you could cover the Trump administration. So I'm curious for your thoughts on where you think we're going. And then the last question is, and this is how we end all of our interviews, and that is, what advice do you have for young journalists, potentially those who might want to cover the White House, the next Peter Baker?
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, you're right. I mean, who would think that those off-year elections would seem so big and so important? It was just 9 days ago. It feels like it was a month ago or more
Yeah,
already,
I,
right? It's like dog years. Every day in the news world right now is like 7 days or a week or a month or a year. And
and
so
you
you're
have all your hair still, which is really impressive.
Oh, well, there are days, believe me. But yeah, it's so you can't really make predictions because I didn't have all this on my bingo card, and I think that we ought to be humble enough to realize that predictions are probably not a good idea anymore. That we are not able to see that far in the future. But I think one thing we can say about the future is it will be busy, and he has a
Yeah,
way of keeping the news going. What's remarkable is we're not just 9 or 10 months into this; we're 10 years into the Trump era at this point. 10 years in the Trump
yeah.
era. And he continues to surprise and shock and agitate people and get people paying attention to him. And I think about that show of his, the reality show, The Apprentice. And it's worth remembering he kept that show on air for 14 years,
Mm.
right? It was the same show every week. And yet people kept coming back. And again, he manages to captivate people or exasperate people in a way that they pay attention, which is what he wants. He wants people to pay attention. So I think that we are in for a roller coaster ride for the next 3 years or then some. And I wouldn't make any prediction, but I would say, in the answer to your question, that we need new journalists. We need the next generation. We need young journalists to come forward. And I've been meeting with some lately, and I'm so excited by some of the young people I've met lately. I just feel like, the advice for young journalists is follow the facts, follow the truth, have a thick skin, and be open-minded, be fair, but be independent. I've stopped using the word objective, by the way. I don't know if we still use that. I think that's not a great word anymore. Everybody's a person. We all come to the table with our own experiences. I think the best word is independent. And that's the word I think we should be thinking about. Media should be independent. We're not taking sides. We're not Trump's opposition, and I think he wants us to be. Nor are we, cheerleaders for anybody. Our job is to report without fear and favor, and I'm looking forward to the next generation to come along and help us keep up that tradition.
Well, listen, I really, really, really appreciate your time, your thoughtfulness, your perspective. You are a humble man
Mm.
who is maybe not even the second best journalist in his own family.
No,
Kidding, I'm
I'm
kidding.
way down the list.
But actually, I think you're an extraordinary journalist, and because I think covering five presidents from the seat in which you have done it, with a little bit of war correspondent mixed in, and covering what Mitt Romney once called the biggest geopolitical foe of our lifetime, all in a day's work for Peter Baker, and
Mm.
we've covered it all in about 61 minutes. So really appreciate you doing this. Thank you so much, and I wish you continued success and good health.
Alan, thank you. This was great. A lot of fun. Great questions. Really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you did too, and I hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you, sir. Best of luck to you. Best of luck to your family. Take care.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Bye.